The text I want to look at is, as I said before, Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter. And we're going to focus with verse 8 through 11. It says, if a matter of judgment is hidden from you between blood and blood, and between verdict to verdict, and between plague to plague, matters of dispute in your cities, you shall rise up and ascend to the place that Hashem your God shall choose. You shall come to the Kohanim and the Levites and the judges who will be in those days. You shall acquire, and they shall tell you the word of judgment. You shall do according to the word that they tell you from that place that Hashem will choose. And you shall be careful to do according to everything that they teach you, according to the teaching that they will teach you, according to the judgment that they will say to you. You do. You shall not deviate from the word that they will tell you, right or left. I would like to talk to you for a few moments about this, a case for rabbinical authority. A case for rabbinical authority. One of the things that we often hear from our acquaintances and friends that come out of their Christianity, they have a real strong fear of what do we call fear of false authority, authority that is wrong. And why do they have that? Because generally you were told things that were wrong, and so you're a little shaky when it comes to rabbinical authority. Before I dive into sort of the meat of the matter and quote some sources, I want to continue sort of to introduce why this is so important for us, and especially for those people that will be watching and sharing this shiur. The issue is this. I hear it more often than none from people that say, well, isn't Judaism just no different than Christianity in the sense that a man made all these rules, these traditions? There are man-made traditions. And so I'm trying to figure, and usually when I hear that, I want to go, well, why is that an issue for you? All right, because in Judaism, it's very clear God gave men the Torah. Very clear that he gave them the responsibility to pass down halakha and judgment, and to also not deviate from it. For some reason, in the mind of other people, while I can't accept Judaism because it's just another man-made religion. How many's ever heard that? You've heard that before, right? So the point would be is we're going to go to the text, which I just read. This text helps to support the very fact that God set on earth a people that would preserve the Torah, and the judges within the people, that is the Kohanim, the priests, and the Levites, have the responsibility of differentiating the different nuances of the Torah and pass down a ruling, and that we should not deviate from the right or the left. And I liked what Adam said before class. We're living in a world where everybody's talking about the alt-right and the alt-left, right? The alt-right and the alt-left. They're Nazis and they're communists or whatever it is, And the whole point is Hashem is actually showing us here, you need to stay balanced. You need to keep yourself balanced. And how do we keep our balances? Through the authority of the text. If a case is too baffling for you to decide, this is what Hashem says. You shall appear before the Levitical priest or the magistrate in charge at the time. You shall act in accordance with the instructions given to you and the ruling handed down to you. You must not deviate. Now, does the text say that you do this until a certain period of time in history?
All the time.
All the time. Someone would argue maybe within some more liberal forms of Judaism, well, we don't have a Sanhedrin, we don't have a temple, therefore there is no authority. Well, you and I know the authority now is the rabbinical authority that we have today, right? And that rabbinical authority derives its halakha, or its lessons to follow from the text, from the sages of Judaism. Now, what content of Judaism is included in this warning, do not deviate? Maimonides and Nachmanides disagree about the subject that we're going to talk about today. As a matter of fact, one interpreting on the basis of the context of this passage, Maimonides concluded that there are three categories that this is actually talking about. He says in the three categories, matter of fact, it's found in Hilchot Mamrim, and to see Sefer HaMitzvot, Positive Commandment 174. It says, according to the instructions given you, A, these are regulations, decrees, practices that the rabbis instructed to the masses in order to strengthen their faith and improve the world, and the ruling handed down to you. B, these are the three categories. B, these things are learned through one of the 13 rules by which the Torah is interpreted. They announce to you. And then C, these are the received traditions passed on from one person to another. You know, the Torah that's passed on. So he said, this is talking about three categories. Let's go through the three categories again. First, he says, these are the regulation, decrees, and practices that the rabbis instructed to the masses, or the Kohanim, or the Sanhedrin, and which ultimately we have passed on to us today. B, these are the things learned through the 13 rules in which the Torah is interpreted, and they're announced to you. And C, these are also the traditions that are passed on. There's nothing wrong with tradition, okay? Now, there are some people out there who struggle with it because their tradition was so messed up that when they come to new tradition, it's a little fearful. Now, Maimonides' list is quite different. In his Hasagot HaRamban, first principle, this prohibition, he says, do not deviate, refers only to what the rabbi said in interpreting the Torah, such as those things that are deduced from the Torah by Midrash Halakha, using any of the 13 techniques for interpreting the Torah, or interpretations derived from the simple meaning of the scripture verse itself, or part two of B, what was handed down from Sinai. It turns out that Maimonides and Nachmanides, two great sages of Judaism, disagree on whether the two categories A and B, that is the category of rabbinic regulation, decrees, and practices, comprises part of what we are warned not to deviate from. So the idea is the meaning, does it mean all of the Torah? Does it mean just what he's talking about here on matters between blood and matters between plague and disputes between cities? Is he only talking about that? Don't deviate. Or is he putting the whole list of Judaism, that which found in oral Torah and in written Torah? This is something I have to really think about. And if it is only talking about these things, then do we have any grounds now to support the fact that today we have to have rabbinical authority? I'm saying this is a case for rabbinical authority. Why do we say that? Because God put that in the plan. He's the one that set it out. And who am I and what is my position to all of a sudden say he didn't know what he was doing? And the biggest one I hear all the time is, well, can't men make mistakes? Yeah. Yes. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. As Scripture said, if a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, that is when something is not clearly revealed to them, and the rabbis or judges are in disagreement as to the law of the Torah, it is and its prescriptions and punishment. This prohibition cannot include rabbinic regulations such as when they say, for example, to kindle the Hanukkah lights. For this does not come under the rule of scriptural verse. If a case is too baffling for you to decide, rather such regulations are to be observed on the strength of the verse. Ask your father, and he will inform you as to what you should do. Deuteronomy 32, verse 7. You remember that? If you have a situation and you're not sure what to do, ask your father, And that you can also reference that with Shabbat 23a. Now, Maimonides understands the words, if a case is too baffling, this way, meaning that the warning, do not deviate, pertains to the rules of the halakha that are not completely clear to begin with. Since the prohibition deals only with the conditional situation, it does not include regulations, decrees, and practices that are independently set by the sages. Now, the second difference between the two philosophers of Judaism views pertains to their approach to the status of rules of halakha that are derived from the plain sense of the text. Now, according to Maimonides, the prohibition not to deviate refers only to the commandments of the rabbis, whereas commandments that come from the plain sense of the scripture are commandments directly from the Torah. The fundamentals that are explicitly told to Moses at Sinai, they are the 613 commandments. And according to Maimonides' approach, the commandment not to deviate applies to all that the sages have said. So here we have two schools of thought. Everything that the sages say, to include the oral Torah, should be followed to the T. And this one, it says, do not deviate, one saying, this is only coming from the plain text, whatever the plain text is talking about at the time. Now, what does today's modern Judaism say about rabbinical authority? Can you help me? What do they say, the importance? Is it important or not important?
It's important.
Absolutely. Well, it does. You're right. But I'm saying in Orthodox Judaism. Yeah, in Orthodox Judaism, rabbinical authority is absolutely important. Even down to the local community, whether Sephardic or Ashkenazi, that local community can have some traditions that are a little adjusted according to the way the rabbi teaches, correct? So the issue is this now. What happens if the rabbis come up with a ruling that's wrong? Do you have the choice to not do it? No. Not according to Rashi. You don't have...
Not unless it's a blatant Torah objection.
That's it. If it's a blatant Torah objection, let's say, for example, he says, it's all right to eat treif.
No.
Okay? It's all right to eat pork.
No.
Automatically, you know, this is against the plain written text of the Torah. We don't do it.
Need a new rabbi.
Need a new rabbi real quick. Right. Well, yeah, you know, there were during the Holocaust, there was rulings by the rabbis about certain things because you could not eat kosher in that environment. Most of the stuff they ate was bug-ridden. You just didn't have a choice. Matter of fact, probably the only source of protein, right, in their diet was to eating the bugs. So the idea is this: if we have no choice but to follow the rule of the rabbi, the big question again: what if the rabbis make a mistake? The onus is on them. Not me, not you. But we don't get to go, well, I just don't like that, and so I don't do it. I don't agree with that. Yes, ma'am.
This morning, Rabbi Wolbe said that, talking about that when the rabbis or whoever made the mistake, he said, everyone following the same mistake is better than everyone going their own way.
Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. And that's, you know, in a world in which most people that are watching these videos have been in, were in, or still in, it's very painful when you realize that I have followed the instructions of men that were completely wrong. Now, I would say the confidence that I have now is different than the confidence I had back then. My confidence now is based on the fact that I can go do the research and the homework and find out if what the rabbis are saying is true and important to the text. Now, one asked me, isn't it possible that someone could change something and the text not be right at some place at time, and you're just following it as if it's the absolute 100% truth? Yeah, I guess it's possible. Anything's possible.
Maybe in English.
Maybe in English, yeah. But the whole issue is Judaism has had this ethos to always have textual integrity in everything they do, like carefully scribing things. Now, the problem is when they translate from Aramaic or Hebrew, a lot of English translations are terrible. And we find this out by some of the studies that Rabbi Katz have been doing, right? You read it in Hebrew and it clearly does not say that. And even now you can be scanning through and reading Hebrew, which is a good practice to do, and you'll come across the word and you see what the English translation of it is, and you go check the word, you go, well, I could see in a big world of big shotgun effect, maybe that's a good word, but there's better words to describe that. So, but the point is this: if rabbinical authority establishes something, we don't have a choice but to follow it. And why? Now, this is really the big thing. Why? Is it because we are in a cult and, if they tell us to jump off a bridge, we jump off a bridge?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. You're right, absolutely not. So what is this big thing? The thing is this: the king of the universe selected a people, the Israelite people. He took them out of Egypt. He gave the Kohanim and the priesthood the responsibility to take this Torah, which was divine in its source, essence, and translate it or bring it into the physical world, and to somehow make this very spiritual, divine word and Torah words into everyday practice. And they had to have the responsibility to make judgment calls on this stuff. I'm not the creator, you're not the creator, and we don't get to decide, I don't like that. Right? I've heard people say, well, I don't like the fact that Jews think that they're the only people that have the truth, or that have the truth. And I say, well, guess what? You don't really get to determine that. God got to determine that. And if you don't like it, then you have to deal with God, not with the Jewish people. I'm telling you, there's a scene in the movie called, what's the scene? Where they're living in the woods during the war. Defiance. And the young guy says, choose another covenant people. This is like too much. Can you just choose somebody else, right? They were given the responsibility, and that's what we follow. Now, the righteous of the nations, how do they follow after, quote unquote, halakha? That's really not an issue of importance. But if you're going to do a mitzvah, you've got to do it as the rabbis described it to be done. And if they tell you that when you do a mitzvah, that you are not you're not doing it for, because you are commanded to do it, that you're doing it out of just love for Hashem, then that's the way it is. Now, you can say all day long that, well, I'm commanded and I have to do all of these. You can say it all day long. It just doesn't make it true, just because you feel like it, right? And we don't get to make up our own religion because it's forbidden. Who makes that determination?
God.
Right. And how did God disseminate that information? Through his people. So the idea is there is a flow chart. Now, maybe it's because we're in Texas and we're Americans, as President Bush would say. We're Americans. We don't want anybody telling us how to do things, right? We're very independent-minded. You don't tell me what to do. I'm a Texan, right? I'm an independent person. The problem is Judaism teaches us interdependence, and the interdependence is on the Creator and his people. We have to depend on each other. We need each other. How do we know how to conduct ourselves in the righteous of the nations? Is by taking the tzitzit of a Jew and saying, teach us. That's how it's done. And that's what we've been doing. And so for those who are listening, who are still scratching their head and going, I'm really not sure if I trust the rabbis, it doesn't matter if you trust them. This is the way it's set up. Doesn't matter if you trust them. And that's hard. I know that sounds like in your face, get over it, you have to deal with it. But the point is, who else are you going to trust? And then I've heard people say, well, I'll just trust God. Well, that's great. But God speaks through the Torah, who's been preserved by the Jewish people and actually is taught by rabbinical authority. So how are you going to know what God says?
The Torah became an earthly institution.
It is. It's absolutely the earthly institution in government that rules all of physicality. Incredible. So we're living in this world in which there's chaos all around us. And the reason why so many from the nations are taking on themselves a love for Torah and love for God is simply because there's order. And so let me explain the big picture. Let's get into one of those drones, and we're going to fly at about 900 feet. I'm just going to look at the big camp, look at the big picture. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, atones for he and his family, the Kohanim, right? And the Levites. And the Kohanim and the Levites do work in the temple to atone and to lead the people. And the people are called to be priests to the nations. The nations go to the priest of the nations to get instruction. That's where we go. That's the big picture. And the nations, when they enjoin themselves with the people, they become the ger and the gate. They become the people that are sort of surrounding the whole camp. And then finally, unity comes to the world. The ultimate way that unity and Mashiach is going to bring about world peace is when the world realizes two things. When the Jew realizes that he has a mandate from God, or she has a mandate from God, to be a light. That's the mandate. And being a light isn't wearing a furry hat, okay? Being a light is teaching universal Torah values. That's being a light. Being a light is helping the non-Jew who doesn't understand these concepts of idolatry and what's idolatry, what's not idolatry, and helping them to understand what idolatry is. I mean, there is even in the text, in this Parashat this week, it even defines, and there's a great lesson in this, and we'll talk about tomorrow, but it's not only just idols, but it's even things associated with idolatry. God says, no. And here's the example. You remember when all of the great patriarchs built altars to God, right? Built altars, gave sacrifices, even Noah. Then God says, no more. Don't do it because the Canaanites do this. So something that he accepted in the past, no more, no mas. We're not going to do this because the Canaanites do this. And so the question is like we were talking about the other day, what do we do with our Bible that has Christian scriptures in it? When you read this text, you realize God says, no, as a matter of fact, don't derive anything from it. And how about this? Oh man, I shouldn't say this. I'm probably going to get in trouble. Listening to Christian music is something you shouldn't do. Huh? Bury it. Give it a funeral. Yeah, bury it. Respectfully. You don't want to throw it in the trash because you also have Hebrew scriptures with it. But listening to Christian music is like, that's one of the things, because now there's this concept, well, what about the aesthetic value? You know what I'm talking about, the aesthetic value? For example, let's say I love architecture and I love to go into church to see architecture, right? That's like a really funny area. But when you really get into the text, when we start dealing with the text, when God says, don't build these altars anymore, I mean, very clearly, he accepted sacrifices on altars before, and now he's not doing it. And even the ones that said, even the altars that were erected, he says, when you move to that area, tear them down. Don't keep them up. You don't allow them aesthetically, well, it's a nice piece of architecture, reminds us of the past history of the Canaanite people. No, tear it down. So the idea, there is a debate, if you have embraced Torah, and God says not to have anything to do with these things, that means not even bringing artwork in your house that is from that. Even though you say, it's pretty, aesthetically, it looks pretty. But that would be tantamount to an Israelite bringing idolatrous artifacts into their tent and burying it. Remember this? How about during the invasion of Canaan, where they came out of Jericho and a whole family was destroyed over that one thing?
Nearly lost the battle.
Nearly lost the battle. the next battle they fought.
Many people died over that.
Right. Over one person's aesthetic value. He wasn't doing it because he wanted to worship idols. He took things that were related to idolatry and buried them for the aesthetic value. That's huge. Boy, I got off on that big. But the reason, where do we get this from? We get it from rabbinical authority. We get it from the authorities that passed down, that God gave to the Jewish people, and ultimately the Jewish people are now passing this on to the nations. Huge. Any questions, comments, fears, doubts, unbeliefs? Now would be the time to do it. Yes, sir.